They called it the war to end all wars. Yet just 20 years after the silence of 1918, the world trembled once again. From the ashes of old empires rose new powers, hungry, restless, uncertain of their destiny. The sky over Europe darkened, not with clouds, but with ambition. Germany, humiliated and broken after the Treaty of Versailles, seethed beneath the weight of its defeat. And into that bitterness stepped a man who promised revival: Adolf Hitler. His words ignited the hearts of the desperate, his dreams fed on anger and loss. Meanwhile, in Italy, Mussolini's fascist march echoed through ancient streets, reviving Rome's ghost. In Japan, military leaders looked toward the Pacific and saw not ocean, but empire. The world seemed to be sleepwalking, drifting through treaties, peace conferences, and fragile alliances that would soon shatter like glass. Factories began to hum again, not for peace, but for preparation. In the corridors of London, whispers grew: could it happen again? In Moscow, Stalin watched and waited, his plans as cold and calculating as the Siberian wind. The League of Nations, meant to preserve peace, stood powerless, its warnings ignored, its resolutions mocked. And in 1939, when German forces stormed across the Polish border, the illusion of peace finally collapsed. The world held its breath. The Blitzkrieg, a word that meant lightning, war unleashed chaos with terrifying speed. Cities fell within days, skies burned with bombers, and the earth shook with the march of boots and steel. Children huddled in shelters, nations called their sons to fight, and history's deadliest conflict began. Yet beneath the thunder of tanks and the roar of aircraft, there was something else: a sense that humanity was crossing a threshold, stepping into an age where destruction would outpace imagination. Some historians say it began as a struggle for territory. Others believe it was always destined: a collision of ideologies and vengeance. Whatever the cause, one truth became clear. The world was no longer divided by oceans or borders, but by survival itself. As Europe burned and empires shifted, one question echoed in the silence between explosions: how had we come to this? And perhaps more chillingly, how far would humanity go this time? Asterisk, as the German war machine roared forward, Europe collapsed in a matter of months. Poland fell first, crushed between Hitler's armies from the west and Stalin's from the east. A grim pact sealed in secret under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. The map of Europe was redrawn not by diplomats, but by tanks. France, thought to be unbreakable behind the Maginot Line, watched in disbelief as the German Blitz sliced through the Ardennes forest, a place military planners deemed impassable. In 6 weeks, the French Republic fell, and the world gasped. German soldiers marched through Paris as the Eiffel Tower loomed silently, a witness to the end of an era. Britain stood alone. From the cliffs of Dover, people could see the fires of a continent enslaved. Across the Channel, Hitler prepared Operation Sea Lion, his plan to invade the British Isles. But before he could cross the waters, he needed to own the skies. The Luftwaffe came in waves, bombers filling the night sky over London, their sirens screaming like ghosts. The Blitz had begun. Families hid in underground tunnels, listening to the low rumble of destruction above. Children clutched gas masks. Entire streets disappeared overnight. Yet Britain refused to bow. Churchill's voice echoed across radios, steady and defiant: "We shall never surrender." The Royal Air Force fought with everything it had: small squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes, battling hundreds of enemy planes. The Battle of Britain became the first major defeat for Hitler's forces, a turning point carved in courage and smoke. Meanwhile, across Europe, the Nazi shadow stretched further than Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, all swallowed in the same grey tide. Italy joined in, invading North Africa to chase the dream of a new Roman Empire. Spain, still recovering from civil war, remained neutral but scarred, its wounds fresh from fascist victory. And while the guns thundered across the continent, in the east Stalin's purges continued, his paranoia consuming his own ranks. The world was now divided by fear those who fought, and those who waited for the inevitable knock on the door. In the heart of Europe, something darker was forming labor camps, ghettos, a machinery of cruelty disguised as order. Some believed it was only temporary. Others sensed that something far worse was coming. The war for Europe had only just begun, and the world was already bleeding. While Europe burned, the war began to stretch its reach far beyond its borders. Across the Mediterranean, Mussolini sought glory for Italy, launching invasions into Greece and North Africa. But the Italian army, underprepared and overconfident, met fierce resistance. In the harsh deserts of Libya and Egypt, sandstorms swallowed men and machines alike, and the fight for control of the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India, became a deadly chess match. The Germans intervened, sending General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, whose cunning tactics turned the tide of battle and made his name legend. In the Balkans, Hitler moved swiftly to rescue his faltering ally, crushing Yugoslavia and Greece in brutal succession. The skies over Crete filled with German paratroopers, and by the time the dust settled, southern Europe was under Axis control. But behind the victories, Hitler's mind was already focused on something greater, something east. His true ambition had always been the conquest of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was more than a military campaign. It was an ideological crusade. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million Axis soldiers crossed the Soviet border, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was the largest invasion in human history. Villages vanished overnight beneath artillery fire, fields burned, and cities were encircled in days. The Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed, capturing Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, but Russia was vast and unrelenting. As the Germans pressed forward, they met not just soldiers, but the will of a people who refused to die. Scorched earth tactics left nothing behind. Bridges blown, crops destroyed, wells poisoned. Then came winter, earlier and harsher than anyone expected. The German army, unprepared for the cold, froze in its tracks. Tanks stalled, rifles jammed, men collapsed from frostbite. Moscow stood firm, and for the first time, Hitler's unstoppable force faltered. Meanwhile, across the world in Asia, Japan's imperial ambitions grew bolder. Having already invaded China, they looked toward the Pacific and the rich colonies of the West. The world's oceans would soon become battlegrounds, and the war would no longer belong to Europe alone. For now, as snow covered the corpses outside Moscow and the winds howled across frozen plains, one thing became clear: the conflict was transforming into something far greater, something global, and the true cost was only beginning to reveal itself. Far across the Pacific, while Europe tore itself apart, Japan was moving with quiet precision toward its own empire. For years, its armies had ravaged China, from the horror of Nanjing to the siege of Shanghai. Driven by a vision of destiny, the belief that Japan was meant to rule Asia. Yet, as their ambitions grew, so too did the tension with the West. The United States, alarmed by Japan's expansion, cut off vital oil and steel supplies. believing sanctions would halt aggression. Instead, they ignited it. On a calm Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, as the Hawaiian sun rose over Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft appeared suddenly in the sky. Within minutes, the harbor was a sea of fire. Battleships capsized, planes exploded on the runway, and black smoke blotted out the morning light. Over 2,400 Americans died that day. The next morning, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared it a date which will live in infamy. The United States was now at war. Japan struck everywhere at once. Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. One by one, the colonies of Europe fell under the rising sun. Singapore, thought to be an impregnable fortress, surrendered after just a week. American and Filipino troops, trapped on the Bataan Peninsula, fought until starvation and disease claimed them. And those who survived were forced on the infamous Bataan Death March. Japan's empire expanded with breathtaking speed, stretching from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands. Tokyo celebrated victory after victory, its generals believing that the Pacific was now theirs. But beneath the triumph, a sleeping giant had awakened. American factories roared to life, producing ships, tanks, and aircraft faster than any nation in history. The Pacific, once a tranquil expanse, was about to become a graveyard of fleets. In the shadows of Japan's victories, resistance movements began to rise, and the Allies started to plan their counterstrike. The world was now truly at war. Europe, Africa, Asia, and the oceans between them. For millions, there was nowhere left untouched. As the Japanese flag flew over Manila and Rangoon, and as US sailors buried their dead at Pearl Harbor, one question began to echo through both sides of the ocean. How long could this fire burn before it consumed the world entirely? In the summer of 1941, as dawn broke over the plains of Eastern Europe, a storm unlike any before it began to move. 3 million German soldiers, along with hundreds of thousands from Axis allies, surged across an 1,800-mile front. Tanks growled through the wheat fields, aircraft darkened the skies, and artillery thundered without pause. It was Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Hitler's armies were now driving straight toward the heart of the Soviet Union. Too many Germans. This was to be the final Crusader war of annihilation, meant to destroy communism and carve out new living space for the Reich. The Red Army, caught off guard, fell back in chaos as entire divisions were encircled and destroyed. Cities like Minsk and Smolensk were swallowed by flames, their defenders either captured or buried beneath rubble. By September, German forces surrounded Kiev, trapping nearly 700,000 Soviet troops in a colossal ring of steel. It was a victory so vast that even Hitler was astonished. Yet every mile forward brought greater resistance. The Soviet land seemed endless, its winters merciless, its winters merciless, its people unyielding. German supply lines stretched thin, and tanks began to freeze before reaching Moscow. In the north, the city of Leningrad was surrounded, beginning a siege that would last 900 days. Civilians starved as temperatures dropped below -30 degrees, yet the city refused to fall. In Moscow, Stalin rallied his people with a single command: not one step back. Soviet factories were dismantled piece by piece and reassembled beyond the Ural Mountains, where workers, many of them women and children, built tanks and rifles through endless nights. As the snow deepened, the Germans finally reached the outskirts of Moscow. Their soldiers exhausted, their engines frozen, their dreams of quick victory fading into the icy wind. And then, from the east, came the reserve's fresh Soviet divisions, hardened by the Siberian cold. In December, they struck back, pushing the Germans away from the gates of the capital. For the first time since the war began, Hitler's army had been stopped. Barbarossa had opened a new front of unimaginable scale, and its failure would mark the turning point of the entire war. But in those dark months of 1941, no one yet knew how deep the blood would run before the tide began to change. As 1942 began, the Eastern Front had become a frozen wasteland of death and endurance. The snow-covered ruins of villages marked the path of retreating armies, and the land itself seemed to consume everything within it. German soldiers, wrapped in rags and shivering in trenches, faced a foe that refused to die. Soviet snipers haunted the forests, unseen but always present, their single shots echoing like whispers of revenge. Entire fields were littered with the burnt shells of panzer tanks, their iron carcasses half buried in ice. Hitler refused to retreat, demanding that his troops hold their ground no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Stalin's Red Army was rebuilding stronger, more coordinated, and more ruthless. Soviet factories, hidden deep in the Urals, now produced tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. The T-34 simple, durable, unstoppable, rolled out by the thousands. With it came a new spirit among Soviet soldiers, a belief that they could push the invader back, no matter how many lives it cost. The German High Command, still reeling from the failed assault on Moscow, turned its eyes south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Fuel had become the lifeblood of war, and Hitler was desperate to seize it. His plan was simple: capture Stalingrad, cut the Volga, and choke the Soviet war machine. Yet, in this city, named after Stalin himself, the German advance would meet something more powerful than steel. As the summer heat returned, the Wehrmacht moved once again across the steppes. Stalingrad rose in the distance, a city of smoke, metal, and shattered concrete. To Hitler, it was a prize of pride. To Stalin, it was a symbol that could never fall. The coming battle would consume more than 1 million lives, turning city streets into rivers of blood. Soldiers would fight from room to room, building to building, among the ruins of factories and the bones of the dead. Each day would bring the same question: who would break first? The Germans, exhausted and starving, or the Soviets, willing to die where they stood? As winter approached once again, the front lines froze in place. But beneath that stillness, the fate of the entire war was beginning to shift. Stalingrad was no longer just a battlefield, had become the graveyard of empires. In the summer of 1942, Stalingrad stood as both a fortress and a warning, a sprawling industrial city along the Volga River, where steel, fire, and blood would merge into one of history's most brutal confrontations. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, advanced with relentless precision, confident that the Soviet defenses would crumble like all before them. The Luftwaffe rained bombs upon the city, reducing entire districts to dust and ash. Streets vanished beneath smoking rubble, the air thick with the stench of fire and flesh. Civilians, men, women, even children were trapped in the inferno, many picking up rifles to defend their homes. When the Germans entered the city, they found not an army, but a labyrinth of resistance. Soviet soldiers hid in the ruins of factories, beneath staircases, inside collapsed basements. Each building became a fortress, every floor a separate battlefield. The fighting was so close that enemies could hear each other breathing through the walls. Snipers haunted the skyline, their rifles silent instruments of patience and death. Among them, legends like Vasily Zaitsev emerged, men who could end a life with a single shot and vanish like ghosts. Days turned into weeks, and the Volga ran red with blood as the Soviets ferried reinforcements across under constant bombardment. Hitler demanded victory at any cost, but the deeper his army pushed, the more the city seemed to consume them. The winter arrived again, cruel and unyielding. Supplies ran out. Ammunition froze in crates. Soldiers starved in cellars, surrounded by corpses. And then, in November 1942, the Soviets struck. Operation Uranus Encirclement, from both north and south, closed the trap around Stalingrad. The mighty Sixth Army was surrounded. Over 300,000 Axis troops were trapped with no escape. Their once unstoppable power now reduced to desperation. Hitler forbade surrender, promising air support that never came. By January 1943, frostbite, hunger, and disease had done what the Soviet guns could not. Soldiers burned furniture for heat, gnawed on scraps of frozen meat, and wrote letters they would never send. On February 2nd, Paulus surrendered. The once proud German army lay broken in the ruins of Stalingrad. It was the turning point of the war, the moment when the tide of history began to shift east to west, and the shadow of Nazi invincibility was finally shattered. But victory came at a terrible cost. The city had become a grave for over 2 million souls, a monument of endurance carved from suffering itself, while the snows of Stalingrad buried one army in the east. Another battle raged across the burning sands of North Africa. The desert stretched endlessly beneath the blinding sun, where heat waves shimmered and mirages danced upon the horizon. Here, tanks replaced ships, sand replaced sea, and every hill became an island of death. German Field Marshal Erwin, Rommel known to both friend and foe, as the Desert Fox moved his Afrika Korps with surgical precision, outmaneuvering the British again and again. His tanks glided over dunes like predators, striking swiftly and vanishing before the enemy could respond. To the British Eighth Army, led by General Bernard Montgomery, North Africa had become a nightmare of dust and defeat. Yet, as the months passed, the tide began to turn. The Allies adapted, learning the rhythms of desert warfare, the importance of fuel, and the cost of arrogance. Logistics became the true weapon. Whoever could move food, water, and ammunition across the endless wasteland would win. The skies above filled with the roar of bombers. The ground trembled beneath the clash of armor. And from the Atlantic coast to the Nile, the fate of empires hung in balance. The Battle of El Alamein became the breaking point. Montgomery's forces, reinforced and resupplied, stood firm as Rommel's exhausted divisions hurled themselves against British defences. For 12 days, in late 1942, the desert burned with fire and smoke. Artillery thundered through the night as tracer rounds carved glowing arcs across the dunes. And when the dust cleared, Rommel was in retreat. Winston Churchill would later say, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Yet for the Germans, this retreat was only the beginning of the end. Soon after, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch, opening a new front that crushed Axis hopes in Africa. Rommel's troops, caught between the British advancing from the east and the Americans from the west, fought valiantly but were cornered. By May 1943, the remnants of the once mighty Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia. The dream of Nazi domination in Africa had turned to dust. The Allies now controlled the southern gateway to Europe. The victory in North Africa was more than strategic, it was symbolic. It proved that Hitler's war machine could bleed, could falter, could fall. And as the desert winds carried the last echoes of battle away, a new invasion was already being planned, one that would strike at the soft underbelly of the Axis, Italy. From the scorched sands of North Africa, the Allies turned their eyes northward, toward Europe's underbelly, toward Mussolini's Italy. In July 1943, under a sky heavy with storm clouds and gunfire, Allied ships crossed the Mediterranean. The operation began with the invasion of Sicily, an island fortress defended by German and Italian troops, who knew that losing it meant opening the door to the continent itself. The sea was alive with warships, landing craft, and the low hum of aircraft above. When the first Allied soldiers stormed the beaches, the resistance was fierce. Yet it soon became clear that Italian morale was crumbling. Villages once painted with fascist banners now stood silent, their people watching as German soldiers retreated and American tanks rolled through. Within weeks, Mussolini was deposed and arrested by his own countrymen. The dictator who had promised a new Roman Empire was now a prisoner of his former allies. But Hitler would not let Italy fall so easily. German forces rushed south, fortifying mountain passes and turning the Italian peninsula into a killing ground. When the Allies landed at Salerno in September 1943, they faced not a broken enemy but a determined one. The German army fought from ridge to ridge, turning every river and hill into a fortress. Rain poured, mud swallowed vehicles, and the mountains echoed with artillery that never seemed to stop. The Allied advance was painfully slow. In January 1944, in an attempt to outflank the enemy, they landed at Anzio, but what was meant to be a bold strike became a deadly stalemate. For months, soldiers lived in foxholes, surrounded by German guns, their only company the constant scream of shells overhead. And in the heart of Italy, another battle raged, the destruction of Monte Cassino. The ancient monastery, standing atop a mountain, became a symbol of defiance and tragedy. Allied bombers reduced it to rubble, unaware that civilians hid within its walls. When the fighting finally ended, the monastery was nothing more than ashes on a hill, and tens of thousands lay dead below it. Yet, by mid-1944, Rome fell to the Allies. The bells of the Eternal City rang not for conquest, but for survival. Italy had switched sides. Mussolini fled north under German protection, and the road to Germany was open. But the cost had been staggering. Every mile of progress had been paid for in blood. The liberation of Italy was no triumphal march. It was a reminder that victory in this war would demand everything, while the Allies bled their way up Italy. The true crucible of the Second World War burned in the east. The vast plains of the Soviet Union had become a graveyard of armies, where men froze, starved, and vanished into the snow. By 1943, after the catastrophe at Stalingrad, the Red Army had clawed back from the edge of annihilation. The Germans, who had once believed themselves unstoppable, now faced an enemy that would not die. Operation Citadel, Hitler's last great offensive in the east, was launched in July 1943. Targeting the city of Kursk, it was the largest tank battle in history. A storm of steel where more than 6,000 armored beasts clashed on the Russian steppe. The air was thick with dust and smoke. The ground quaked beneath the treads of Panzer and T-34 alike, and the sky burned with tracer fire. For days the outcome hung in the balance, but when the dust settled, it was Germany that bled. The Soviet defenses held, and the counterattack that followed shattered the Wehrmacht's armored strength forever. From that point, the tide in the east turned irreversibly. City by city, field by field, the Red Army pushed westward. Entire towns were found erased, their people buried under rubble or snow. Villages once filled with life were now ghostly monuments to famine and war. The brutality of both sides reached new depths. German troops fought with the desperation of men who knew what awaited them if they failed. And Soviet soldiers advanced with a fury born from years of massacre and suffering. Winter came again, and with it, death. The cold was merciless, freezing the living and preserving the dead where they fell. The roads to Kiev, Minsk, and Smolensk became corridors of wreckage. In the ruins of recaptured cities, Soviet soldiers found evidence of horrors beyond imagination: mass graves, children's shoes, the skeletal remains of entire families. Vengeance now fueled their advance. By late 1944, the Red Army stood on the borders of Poland. The once invincible German war machine shattered, retreating toward its homeland. But the victory was not clean. The land behind them was a wasteland, and the price of every gained mile was measured in bodies. For the men of the Eastern Front, there were no heroes, only survivors. The frozen hell had devoured millions, and yet the worst was still to come. For the path ahead led straight into the heart of Germany itself. As the snows melted in the east, another storm was building across the Channel. In England, under constant rain and tension, thousands of Allied troops trained for an invasion that would decide the fate of Europe. They called it Operation Overlord, but history would remember it as D-Day. For months, deception blanketed the plan's fake armies built from inflatable tanks. False radio transmissions and phantom generals convinced the Germans that the assault would come at Calais. But on the dawn of June 6, 1944, the truth came roaring through the mist over Normandy. The sea was alive with ships, over 5,000 of them spilling men, machines, and chaos onto the beaches. The first wave faced a wall of fire. Machine guns tore through the surf, shells exploded in the sand, and men drowned before even reaching the shore. Yet through smoke, fear, and blood, they advanced. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sordidge Beach, carved into history by sacrifice. The cost was unimaginable, but the foothold was won. France was no longer a prison. It was a battlefield. The Allies poured in. British, Americans, Canadians, Free Frenchage stepped forward, breaking the back of the German defenses. Town by town, hedge by hedge, they moved inland, the countryside echoing with artillery and the cries of liberation. In Paris, resistance fighters rose, sabotaging rail lines and ambushing retreating troops. By August, the city, starved and brutalized, rose up. And when the first Allied tanks rolled through its boulevards, the people wept. But even as bells rang in celebration, the cost of freedom was staggering. Entire villages had been obliterated by retreating German forces. The road eastward was soaked in blood and wreckage. Yet the Allies pressed on toward the Rhine, toward the heart of Hitler's crumbling empire. Behind them, Europe was awakening from years of nightmare, but its scars would never fade. The liberation was both victory and revelation. The concentration camps, discovered as the Allies advanced, revealed truths so monstrous that many soldiers broke down weeping. The war, once seen as strategy and territory, had turned into a confrontation with evil itself. And as the Western Front pushed closer to Germany, one question began to whisper through the ranks. How long could the Reich hold before the walls of Berlin finally fell? By early 1945, The war that had begun with lightning strikes and triumphant marches was collapsing into rubble and ruin. Germany, once the conqueror of Europe, now stood encircled, its cities in ashes, its armies shattered, its people starving beneath skies filled with Allied bombers. The Reich, built on arrogance and terror, was dying. In the west, the Allies had crossed the Rhine, their tanks rolling through the heartland of Germany. In the east, the Red Army advanced like an unstoppable tide, driven by vengeance and loss. Every mile they gained was paid for in blood, but they would not stop until Berlin burned. The once proud Wehrmacht was now a ghost of its former self, reduced to old men and teenage boys fighting hopeless battles among the ruins. In cities like Cologne and Hamburg, civilians huddled in basements as firestorms raged above them. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to glowing skeletons of stone. The air smelled of ash, the nights glowed red, and the sound of war was unending. Inside his bunker beneath Berlin, Adolf Hitler raged against reality. His empire was gone, his armies destroyed, his allies dead or defected. Yet he clung to delusion, ordering imaginary divisions into battle, believing in salvation that would never come. Above him, Berlin was being torn apart street by street. The Soviets bombarded the city with relentless fury, reducing every block to dust. Civilians tried to flee, but the city was sealed no escape, no mercy. By April, the Red Army had surrounded the capital. Inside the Vorbunker, Hitler married Eva Braun, and 2 days later, they took their own lives. Their empire of death had ended as it began in violence and deceit. The news spread like a whisper through the ruins. Some celebrated, others simply stared in silence. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. But victory did not feel like triumph. The continent lay in ruins, millions dead, cities destroyed, families erased. From Stalingrad to Dresden, from Warsaw to Normandy, Europe had become a graveyard of civilizations. The cost of ending tyranny had been almost as great as tyranny itself. As soldiers walked through the silent streets of Berlin amid the smoke and the ghosts, they realized that what had been destroyed was not just a nation, but the illusion that war could ever bring glory. While Europe breathed its first uneasy sigh of peace across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the fire still burned. Japan, battered yet unbroken, refused to surrender. The islands of the Pacific had become stepping stones of agony, each one a fortress, each one defended to the last man. From Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, the fighting was unlike anything the world had seen. The ocean shimmered deceptively calm, but beneath its waves lay the wrecks of ships, planes, and thousands of men. The tropical air was thick with the smell of rot and gunpowder. American Marines clawed their way ashore under endless artillery, facing bunkers carved deep into volcanic rock. The Japanese defenders, driven by a code of death before dishonor, launched banzai charges through the smoke, fighting even after their positions were lost. Iwo Jima became a symbol of both endurance and despair. Out of 21,000 Japanese soldiers, only a few hundred were taken alive. When the flag rose over Mount Suribachi, it marked not victory but the beginning of the final nightmare. Okinawa followed, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. It was hell on earth. Civilians caught in the crossfire leaped from cliffs rather than face capture, convinced by propaganda that death was better than life under the enemy. The rains turned the island into a sea of mud and blood, where bodies lay half buried in the earth. Kamikaze pilots filled the skies, turning their planes into weapons of desperation. Each one who fell left behind a name, a family, a note of honor that would never be read. By mid-1945, Japan's empire had crumbled, its navy shattered, its cities burning under relentless American bombing. Yet still, no surrender. The Allies prepared for an invasion that could cost millions of lives. And then science changed everything. In the desert of New Mexico, a new kind of light had been born, a light that could erase entire cities. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon, it was a sentence. In July, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding unconditional surrender. Japan refused. The world was about to witness power beyond comprehension. The next move would not just end the war, it would redefine humanity itself. At dawn on August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay took off from the island of Tinian. Its destination was Hiroshima, a city alive with workers, children, and soldiers preparing for another uncertain day in a war that had already consumed millions. The air was clear, calm, deceptively peaceful. Then, at 8:15 a.m., the sky ignited. In an instant, a blinding flash brighter than the sun swallowed the city whole. The bomb, code named Little Boy, detonated with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. Buildings vaporized, streets vanished, and within seconds, tens of thousands of lives were gone. Shadows of people were seared into stone. Those who survived the blast stumbled through the ruins, their skin hanging in ribbons, calling out names that would never be answered. The air itself seemed to burn. Fires spread across the city, merging into a storm of heat so intense that it sucked oxygen from the lungs. 3 days later, on August 9th, the nightmare repeated. The second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. The city vanished beneath a mushroom cloud that rose miles into the sky, turning day into twilight. Hospitals, homes, temples, all erased in an instant. In both cities, the suffering did not end with the explosion. Radiation poisoned the survivors, twisting life into something cruel and slow. Mothers searched for children who no longer existed. Water turned to death for those who drank it. The world stood silent, stunned by what had been unleashed. The bombs had achieved what years of war could not. Japan's will to fight was broken. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation in a trembling voice, announcing surrender. For the first time, his people heard him speak. The war, the most destructive in human history, was finally over. Yet peace came not with relief, but with haunting questions. What had humanity become capable of? Could there ever be justification for such light, such fire, such silence? The atomic age had begun, and with it, a new kind of fear, one that no soldier could fight, no army could defend against. In the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, victory and horror became indistinguishable, and the line between creation and destruction vanished forever. When the guns finally fell silent, the world looked upon itself and barely recognized what it saw. Entire nations had been erased, their cities reduced to skeletons of concrete and twisted metal. The air still carried the stench of smoke and decay. And the silence that followed the last battle was not peace, it was exhaustion. Across Europe and Asia, millions wandered without homes, families, or names. They were called displaced persons, survivors of bombings, of camps, of invasions that had no mercy. Children searched for parents who would never return. Soldiers walked roads that led nowhere. The great capitals of civilization, Berlin, Warsaw, Tokyo, London, were all scarred. their skylines punctured by the memory of fire. In Germany, the victors divided the spoils. The Allied powers America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union each took a piece of the fallen Reich. Berlin itself became a city split in four, its heart divided between freedom and control. In the east, Soviet influence spread like a shadow over Poland, Hungary, and Romania, reshaping borders with steel and fear. In the west, the United States and Britain worked to rebuild what could be saved, pouring resources into a broken continent through what would become the Marshall Plan. But beneath the talk of reconstruction, the seeds of a new conflict were already being planted. In Asia, the devastation was even deeper. Japan lay in ruins, its cities flattened, its empire dissolved. American occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur began the slow work of rebuilding, rewriting Japan's constitution, disbanding its army, and planting the fragile roots of democracy in soil still hot with grief. Meanwhile, in China, civil war reignited between the nationalists and the communists, a war that would shape the future of Asia for generations. The ghosts of World War II lingered in every corner of the planet. Railways carried survivors back to towns that no longer existed. Villagers rebuilt homes beside mass graves. Cemeteries expanded faster than cities could rise again. And in every nation, the question echoed: how could humanity recover from such darkness? 6 years of global conflict had left behind a world that could never again pretend innocence. The victors stood triumphant, but even they looked to the horizon with unease, because from the ashes of World War II, a new kind of war was already forming, not of trenches and tanks, but of ideology, power, and fear. The world was free, but it was no longer safe. As the smoke cleared and the nations began to rebuild, the world turned its gaze to those responsible for its agony. Justice, for once, would not be left to vengeance alone. In November 1945, in the bombed-out city of Nuremberg, Germany, the victors assembled a court unlike any before it. Judges and prosecutors from the Allied nations gathered to hold the leaders of the Nazi regime accountable for crimes that defied comprehension. The Nuremberg trials began not merely as punishment, but as a declaration that humanity must answer for its own darkness. The defendants sat behind glass, the architects of destruction reduced to silent figures in grey suits. Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, who once commanded empires, now waited to hear the words that would seal their fate. Evidence poured in, not of ordinary war, but of something beyond it. Films, photographs, and testimonies exposed the machinery of genocide: the death camps, the gas chambers, the starvation, the forced labor. Survivors stood before the court and spoke in voices trembling with truth. They told of families taken in the night, of smoke rising from chimneys that burned the dead, of doctors who experimented on children in the name of science. The world listened in horror. For the first time, the phrase "crimes against humanity" was spoken as law, not poetry. It would echo through history, shaping how future generations would define evil. 22 men stood trial. 12 were sentenced to death. The hangings came swiftly, yet the shadow of their deeds lingered, untouchable by rope or judgment. But Nuremberg was not the end. Across Asia, similar tribunals unfolded in Tokyo, where Japanese officers and ministers were tried for atrocities committed in China. Korea and Southeast Asia, the rape of human experimentation and forced labor that left millions dead. Some wept in remorse. Others denied everything to the end. Justice was served, yet imperfectly, Many who deserved trial escaped. Some hid behind governments, some were protected by the new politics of a divided world. Still, the trials marked a turning point. Humanity, for the first time, had stared into its own abyss and chosen not to look away. The war had revealed what we are capable of, but Nuremberg and Tokyo asked what we must become to ensure it never happens again. Europe lay in ruins, a graveyard of cities and memories. Berlin was a skeleton of concrete and ash, Warsaw a flattened scar, London a city rebuilt from its own dust. Across the continent, millions wandered with nowhere to return, displaced persons. Refugees, widows, orphans, and prisoners freed from camps who no longer knew what freedom meant. Hunger stalked the streets, and the cold winter of 1946 bit deep into the bones of a generation already hollowed by war. Yet, amid the devastation, something stirred a determination to rebuild not just cities, but civilizations. In the West, under the watchful eyes of the United States, the Marshall Plan poured lifeblood into the veins of Europe. Billions of dollars in aid rebuilt factories, roads, and ports, and with them a fragile sense of hope. Western Europe would rise again, but under a new banner, the shadow of American influence. The promise of democracy, and the uneasy peace of prosperity tied to capitalism. In the East, a different vision took root. The Soviet Union, having lost more than 20 million souls, expanded its reach across Eastern Europe, wrapping it in the iron fist of ideology. Communist governments replaced monarchies and parliaments, and Stalin's vision of a socialist empire began to take shape behind what Churchill would call the Iron Curtain. The world that emerged was not one of unity, but of division. Two superpowers now stood where many empires had fallen, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a silent ideological war that would define the next half-century. But for the ordinary people of post-war Europe, politics mattered less than survival. In ruined churches, candles were lit again. In shattered schools, children learned to read and count amidst rubble. Farmers tilled soil still littered with shrapnel. And musicians played in concert halls, missing half their walls. The scars of war would take decades to fade, yet there was an unspoken agreement among survivors. Life must go on. In Germany, denazification began, though its success was uneven. In Japan, under American occupation, democracy and disarmament reshaped the empire into something new, a nation humbled but not broken. The ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became monuments to silence, reminders of what humanity could unleash if it ever forgot the lessons written in fire and blood. From the ashes of destruction, the modern world began to rise, rebuilt, redefined, and forever haunted by what it had survived. The guns had fallen silent, but peace did not bring comfort. Instead, it birthed a new kind of fear, one that did not march with boots or fall from the sky, but lingered unseen in the tension between two powers, who had won the war yet lost all trust in one another. The United States and the Soviet Union, former allies in blood, now stood on opposite ends of an ideological chasm so vast that the entire world would soon teeter upon it. The Cold War had begun not with battles, but with whispers, spies, and the slow tightening of invisible chains around nations that would become pawns on a global chessboard. In the ruins of Berlin, the seeds of this division took root. The city was carved into sectors, its streets split by ideology before they would later be split by concrete and barbed wire. In Eastern Europe, Stalin's armies remained, not as liberators but as overseers, installing regimes loyal to Moscow and silencing dissent with iron and fear. Meanwhile, in the West, the United States extended its influence through economic aid and military alliances, its most powerful creation being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a collective shield against the shadow in the East. The arms race soon followed, a contest not of armies, but of annihilation. The same technology that had ended the war now became the promise of humanity's extinction. Both sides built arsenals of nuclear fire, each capable of erasing cities in moments. Beneath the surface of peace, submarines prowled the depths with warheads aboard, and bombers circled endlessly, waiting for a signal that everyone prayed would never come. Propaganda became the new battlefield, words, films, and ideologies crafted to win hearts and minds. America spoke of freedom, democracy, and prosperity. The Soviet Union answered with promises of equality, unity, and resistance to Western greed. Yet behind the slogans lay a shared truth. Neither side could afford to blink first. The world's balance now depended on fear. It was a strange peace, colder than winter and sharper than steel, where every victory was also a warning. As the world rebuilt its cities, it constructed bunkers beneath them. As children returned to schools, they learned not only to read, but to hide beneath desks. The age of open war had ended, but in its place rose a colder, quieter, and far more dangerous era, where survival itself depended on silence, calculation, and the hope that no one would press the final button in the aftermath of so much death. The world turned to justice as if it could cleanse the blood that soaked the earth. Courtrooms replaced battlefields, and the gavel became a new kind of weapon. In Nuremberg, under the cold lights of justice, the surviving leaders of the Third Reich faced their reckoning. The world listened as translators echoed the words of the accused men who had once commanded millions, now reduced to shadows, pale and trembling. Evidence was displayed like wounds reopened, photographs of emaciated bodies, films of mass graves, documents bearing signatures that had condemned entire peoples to death. The term crimes against humanity became a language of its own, a vocabulary born of horror. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's right hand, stood defiant to the end, taking his own life before the noose could find him. Others were hanged or imprisoned, while the ordinary soldiers and guards of the Nazi machine blended back into a Europe too exhausted to chase them all. Yet justice did not end in Germany. In the East, Tokyo too became a city of trials. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East sought to judge Japan's leaders for the atrocities committed across Asia, the Nanjing Massacre, the experiments of Unit 731, the death marches that claimed thousands. But even here, justice was selective. Emperor Hirohito remained untouched, spared to preserve stability in the new Japan. Some saw this as wisdom, others as hypocrisy dressed in diplomacy. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials set precedents that reshaped international law, defining genocide and war crimes as acts punishable by humanity itself. But for many survivors, the trials were a hollow comfort. The dead did not rise, and the trauma did not fade. Across the world, victims tried to rebuild lives that could never be whole again. In Poland and France, in China and the Philippines, ghosts lingered in the silence of rebuilt homes. Mothers searched for sons who would never return. Children played on the ruins of history, unaware of the weight their parents carried in their eyes. Justice had been declared, but peace was still a wound slow to heal, easily reopened. The world promised never again, but deep inside, humanity knew the truth. Such promises were fragile, written on paper that burned easily. in a world where memory fades and ambition always returns. As the ashes of war settled into the soil of memory, a new line was drawn across the heart of the planet. It was not carved by armies or marked by rivers, but by ideology, an invisible scar that separated East from West, freedom from control, and capitalism from communism. This was the age of division, the era of borders built not from stone but from fear. In Europe, the Iron Curtain descended, a metaphor made real in watchtowers and barbed wire. Berlin became the symbol of this fracture, its streets split between two worlds, its people divided by walls they could see and rules they could not escape. Families were torn apart overnight as East became shadow and West became light, at least in theory. Propaganda machines on both sides worked relentlessly, crafting stories of the enemy that lived just beyond the horizon. The United States painted the Soviet Union as a cold, godless empire, while Moscow portrayed America as a greedy machine, enslaved by money and materialism. Each side believed it was saving the world. Each side feared it might destroy it. Beyond Europe, the division spread like a contagion. Asia became a chessboard of proxy wars and revolutions. In China, Mao Zedong's Red Army declared victory, transforming the nation into a communist giant. Korea, once united, was torn in two. Its war, a brutal preview of the decades to come, where superpowers would fight not directly, but through the bodies of others. In the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, the struggle for influence was endless. Scopes, revolutions, and uprisings whispered with the breath of Washington or Moscow behind them. The Cold War was not only about weapons, it was about dreams, about which vision of the future would define humanity. In the classrooms of New York and Moscow, children were taught to fear the other side before they could even pronounce its name. The world had survived total war, but now it lived under the quiet terror of annihilation. Satellites began to orbit the Earth, carrying not just technology, but surveillance, suspicion, and the message that nowhere was beyond reach. And while leaders smiled for cameras, shaking hands in brief moments of diplomacy, their nations stood ready, missiles armed, soldiers trained, every clock ticking toward a midnight that everyone prayed would never come. The war was over, but the battle for the soul of the world had only just begun. The victory of 1945 came with a price too vast to count, a debt paid not only in blood but in silence. Behind the grand parades and triumphant speeches lay the unspoken truth that no one had truly won. The world had been saved, perhaps, but it had also been broken. In the factories that once produced tanks, men and women now forged steel for peace. Yet every clang of the hammer echoed with the memory of war. Cities rebuilt themselves upon foundations of ash, and beneath their cobblestone streets, bones still whispered of those who never returned. In the United States, soldiers came home as heroes, yet many could not escape the war still raging inside their minds. They saw the faces of fallen friends and dreams, and woke to a peace they did not recognize. The term shell shock from the First World War evolved into something new, battle fatigue, but the pain remained ancient. In the Soviet Union, the victory was celebrated with banners and medals, but few spoke of the famine, the purges, and the millions who had vanished under Stalin's watch, even as he led his people to triumph. Every family had its ghosts, and the state demanded silence in exchange for survival. Across Asia, victory was hollow. China, drained by invasion and civil war, bled into decades of unrest. Japan, under American occupation, rebuilt with quiet obedience. its people carrying the unspoken shame of what had been done in their name. The atomic age promised progress, yet the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became eternal reminders that humanity had stepped too close to godhood. Europe, though free, was changed beyond recognition. Old empires, British, French, Dutch, were crumbling, their colonies no longer willing to serve, masters weakened by war. Across Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, independence movements rose, fueled by the paradox that the nations who had fought for freedom abroad still held others in chains. The war had redrawn maps, but it had also redrawn hearts. People no longer believed in the permanence of power. They had seen too clearly how easily civilizations could collapse. Victory, they realized, was not the end of conflict, it was merely the beginning of memory. And memory, unlike war, does not fade with time. It lingers, shaping everything that comes after, reminding the living that even peace has a cost. When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke cleared from the skies, the world was left to reckon with the ruins it had created. From Warsaw to Tokyo, from London to Berlin, cities lay in shambles, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble and dust. The scent of death lingered in the air long after the fires had gone cold. Yet amid the devastation, humanity began to rebuild not only the buildings, but the idea of civilization itself. In Europe, survivors clawed their way out of basements and shelters, piecing together homes from the remnants of shattered walls. Children who had known nothing but the sound of air raid. Sirens learned to walk in streets still lined with the skeletal remains of houses. Governments promised recovery, but for many, the reconstruction was deeply personal. A single photograph found in the wreckage could become the foundation for hope. In Germany, where the guilt of destruction ran deeper than the wounds of defeat, the task of rebuilding carried the weight of atonement. Women known as Trauerfrauen, the rubble women worked tirelessly to clear debris with bare hands, their faces covered in dust and determination. Each brick lifted was an act of quiet rebellion against despair. In Britain, rationing continued even in victory. Butter, sugar, and meat were luxuries as the nation struggled to rise from the bombed remains of its cities. Across the Channel, France tried to erase the stains of collaboration, pretending unity where division had thrived. In the East, the Soviet Union built new cities on the bones of the old, monuments rising like cold giants to proclaim strength while hiding scars. Across the Pacific, Japan transformed itself with astonishing speed, trading the sword for the plow, the warship for the factory line. Under the watchful eyes of American occupation, democracy took root in soil still soaked with ash, and the Japanese spirit, shaken but unbroken, turned toward reinvention. But beneath the progress, the silence of trauma hung heavy. Families mourned without graves to visit, without names to remember. The photographs of missing loved ones faded on walls, and unmarked fields became cemeteries of memory. The world was rebuilding, yes, but it was also forgetting, burying not just bodies, but truths too painful to confront. In that silence, a new kind of war was already beginning, not fought with bombs or bullets, but with ideology, mistrust, and fear. The Cold War was being born in the shadows of Reconstruction, as Europe tried to heal. Another division began to take form, one not carved by tanks or artillery, but by politics and paranoia. The old alliances that had triumphed over fascism were splintering under the weight of suspicion. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, Winston Churchill warned, an iron curtain had descended across the continent. Behind it, Soviet influence spread like a slow, inevitable fog. Eastern Europe fell under Moscow's shadow, its governments reshaped by Stalin's will. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania all promised freedom, yet found themselves bound by invisible chains of ideology. The hammer and sickle replaced the swastika in the East, and though the flags were different, the sense of fear remained eerily familiar. In the West, the United States took up a new kind of warfare, one of words, money, and influence. The Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding Western Europe, buying not only prosperity but allegiance. The Soviets saw it as manipulation, a capitalist invasion dressed as charity. The world that had fought together to destroy tyranny was now dividing itself into two armed camps, each convinced of its own righteousness. Berlin, once the proud capital of a fallen empire, became the front line of this new struggle. The city was split in two, half democracy, half dictatorship, a living symbol of a world at odds with itself. Checkpoints replaced borders, and spies replaced soldiers, yet the tension felt no less dangerous. In 1949, the first major test came, the Berlin blockade. Stalin tried to choke the western half of the city into submission by cutting off all roads and railways. But in response, American and British pilots launched the Berlin airlifter, breathtaking display of resolve, flying food and coal into the city for nearly a year. Over 2 million people survived because of the steady hum of engines in the night sky. It was a victory without a battle, a statement that the West would not yield. Yet both sides knew what was at stake. The atomic bomb, once a symbol of ultimate victory, now hung over the world as a threat of mutual destruction. Humanity had survived one world war only to find itself trembling on the edge of another one fought in the shadows, with every silence carrying the weight of catastrophe, the mushroom cloud over. Hiroshima had marked not just the end of a war, but the beginning of an era unlike any before it. The power unleashed by the atom was no longer science fiction, was reality, and it had rewritten the laws of war and peace alike. In the years after 1945, nations raced not to rebuild armies but to command the atom. The United States, once the sole possessor of this ultimate weapon, soon found its monopoly shattered when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949. The world gasped, and the age of balance through terror began. Scientists who once dreamed of progress now found themselves haunted by their creations. Oppenheimer's words echoed like prophecy, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Cities that had risen from ashes now lived under the shadow of a single button, one that could turn them to dust again in moments. The nuclear arms race was both madness and method each, side building, more, faster, stronger, driven by fear of falling behind. Hydrogen bombs followed atomic ones, capable of annihilating millions in an instant. The sky itself became a potential battlefield. From the deserts of Nevada to the steppes of Kazakhstan, the earth trembled with the tests of destruction. Even the oceans and atmosphere bore witness as radiation spread beyond the test sites, touching lives far from the decision-makers who ordered them. Yet for all the horror, there was fascination too. The atom promised limitless energy, and nations sought to tame it for light and power, not war. Atoms for peace, they called it, but behind every reactor, the spectre of the bomb loomed. Children learned to hide under desks as if wood and metal could shield them from a sun born of human arrogance. The world's fear became routiner, raid sirens, fallout shelters, and propaganda films teaching families how to survive what no one truly could. Every nation lived in quiet tension, every leader aware that one misstep could end everything. The balance of power was no longer measured in armies but in megatons, and diplomacy became a game played on the edge of extinction. The nuclear age was not just a new chapter in history, it was a warning, whispered in static across the radio waves of a world holding its breath. As nations armed themselves with weapons capable of erasing civilization, the world faced a different kind of reckoning, one not fought on the battlefield but in the courtroom. In 1945, the city of Nuremberg, still scarred from Allied bombings, became the stage for one of history's most significant trials. The victors gathered, not for vengeance, they said, but for justice. The men who had commanded the machinery of terror, the architects of the Holocaust, the masterminds of aggression were called to account. Cameras rolled as the accused stood in the dock, their uniforms replaced by plain suits, their arrogance hollowed out by defeat. Names like Gring, Hess, Ribbentrop, and Keitel echoed through the chamber. Names once spoken with fear, now bound by the weight of law. The prosecutors laid bare a world of horror, death camps, forced labor, mass executions, medical experiments, piece of evidence, a mirror held up to human cruelty. For the first time, crimes against humanity became a legal reality, words powerful enough to define the indefinable. The testimonies of survivors broke through the silence of denial, their voices trembling but unbroken. Some defendants claimed they were only following orders. Others remained defiant, insisting that history would one day vindicate them. But the verdicts were clear guilt, beyond redemption. 12 were sentenced to hang, and others to long years behind bars. Justice had spoken, but it was imperfect, incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped trial, many victims found no closure. Yet Nuremberg set a precedent, a fragile attempt to hold power accountable, to say that there were lines that could never again be crossed. Across the world, similar tribunals unfolded. In Tokyo, Japan's wartime leaders faced their own judgment. Accused of atrocities in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia, Emperor Hirohito was spared politics, demanded stability, but the scars of his empire's crimes lingered like ghosts across Asia. The trials were not only about punishment, they were about memory, about forcing the world to confront what it wanted to forget. Out of the ruins, the concept of universal human rights began to take root, as the newly formed United Nations declared that dignity belonged to all. Yet even as humanity vowed never again, the seeds of future conflicts were already being sown in Korea, in Vietnam, in Africa, proof that lessons written in blood are often the hardest to keep. In the aftermath of the greatest conflict humanity had ever endured, a new kind of world began to take shape, a world no longer defined by empires, but by influence. The United States emerged from the ashes of war as a superpower, its factories unbombed, its cities intact, its economy booming from wartime production. Across the Atlantic, the Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, rose as its rival, its victory carved in sacrifice and sheer endurance. Together they stood as opposites: capitalism and communism, democracy and dictatorship, claiming to be the guardian of civilization's future. The United Nations was born in 1945, a fragile promise of peace rising from the ruins of the League of Nations. Its flag, a symbol of unity, fluttered over a world still divided. Yet behind the speeches of cooperation, quiet competition grew. Washington and Moscow eyed each other with suspicion, their allies gathered like chess pieces on a global board. The Cold War had no formal declaration, no battlefronts in the traditional sense. But its reach was everywhere, in classrooms, newspapers, laboratories, and skies. Propaganda became a weapon, as each side sought to shape minds as much as territories. The phrase Iron Curtain was no longer metaphor, it was policy, solidified by borders, walls, and barbed wire. Western Europe, rebuilt by American dollars through the Marshall Plan, became a showcase of prosperity, a beacon of what democracy could achieve. In the East, Stalin's grip tightened, his satellite states forced into conformity, their individuality crushed under the promise of collective strength. The two worlds lived in parallel realities, one saturated with consumerism and freedom, the other disciplined by ideology and fear. But amid this tension, humanity continued to reach higher. Science, once bent toward destruction, now turned its gaze to the stars. Rockets that had once carried warheads now carried dreams, and men like von Braun transformed from weapons engineers to architects of exploration. The same rivalry that threatened annihilation also propelled progressing nuclear power. Jet travel and spaceflight, all born from competition. The post-war world was not just rebuilding, it was redefining itself. The colonial empires that had ruled for centuries began to crumble as nations in Asia and Africa demanded independence. A new global order was forming, instable, imperfect, but undeniably newborn from both the triumph and tragedy of the Second World War. And beneath it all, the memory of the conflict still whispered, reminding the world of how easily peace could turn once more into chaos, as the old powers tried to adjust to this new order. The ghosts of empire stirred restlessly. Britain, France, and the Netherlands, once masters of vast colonial domains, faced the slow unraveling of their global rule. The war had drained their coffers and broken their illusion of invincibility. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, voices long silenced by imperial control began to rise in unison, demanding freedom, dignity, and identity. India led the way. In 1947, after nearly 2 centuries of British rule, it gained independence through the tireless struggle of figures like Gandhi and Nehru. But independence came at a price. The subcontinent was torn apart in partition, as religious and political divisions split it into India and Pakistan. The line drawn across maps became a scar across millions of lives. Families were uprooted, trains filled with the dead crossed borders, and neighbors who once shared meals became enemies overnight. The end of empire had begun not with celebration, but with blood. In Indonesia, nationalist fighters clashed with Dutch troops for 4 years before forcing recognition of their republic. In Indochina, the French faced the fierce determination of the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh, setting the stage for decades of war. In Africa, the wave of decolonization spread slowly but inevitably. Ghana gained independence in 1957, a spark that ignited others. Kenya, Algeria, and Congo would follow, often through conflict and chaos, as empires tried desperately to hold on to what history had already taken from them. The colonial world was collapsing, but its legacy remained borders drawn by outsiders. Economies built on extraction, societies fractured by centuries of manipulation. Meanwhile, the superpowers watched closely. The United States and Soviet Union saw in these struggles not just freedom movements, but opportunities for influence. Every revolution became a potential pawn in the Cold War, every new nation a field for ideological contest. The dreams of liberation were quickly tangled in the web of global rivalry. Yet for all its turbulence, decolonization marked one of the most profound transformations in modern history. Billions who had once been subjects became citizens, and the map of the world was redrawn not by conquest but by defiance. Still, even in freedom, the shadows of empire lingered in poverty, in division, and in the silent question of whether true independence had ever really been won. By the 1950s, the fragile balance between the United States and the Soviet Union began to tilt dangerously toward confrontation. Both sides sought to expand their influence, not through direct war, but through proxy conflicts that spanned continents. Korea became the first testing ground of this new reality. In 1950, North Korean forces, backed by Moscow and later by China, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded the South. The United States, leading a United Nations coalition, intervened in defense of South Korea, and within weeks, the peninsula was engulfed in flames. Cities changed hands repeatedly as the frontlines surged north and south, each side convinced they were defending the future of civilization. The brutality of the conflict stunned the world villages razed, prisoners executed, civilians caught in the relentless push and pull of armies. When the war finally froze into a stalemate in 1953, millions were dead and the borders had barely changed. The Cold War had proven that peace could be as fragile as a ceasefire, but Korea was only the beginning. The world became a chessboard of tension, with coups, revolutions, and insurgencies serving as moves in an unseen struggle. In Cuba, Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959 turned an island playground of the West into a communist outpost, just 90 miles from American shores. When the Soviets later stationed nuclear missiles there in 1962, the world came closer to annihilation than ever before. For 13 days, humanity stood on the brink. As warships shadowed each other in the Atlantic and nuclear bombers waited on runways. It was diplomacy, a measure of fear that pulled civilization back from the edge. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended without a shot fired. But the message was clear. A single miscalculation could end everything. Across Asia, new fires burned. In Vietnam, what began as a colonial struggle against the French evolved into another front in the ideological war between East and West. The jungles became the stage for a tragedy that would scar generations. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, coups and alliances shifted like sand as superpowers sought control over oil and influence. The Cold War was no longer cold. It pulsed with proxy wars, espionage, and propaganda. Every conflict, every crisis, carried the same haunting question: how long could the world walk this tightrope without falling into the abyss? As the Cold War deepened, fear became the language of the age. The nuclear arms race accelerated beyond comprehension, each superpower building not hundreds, but tens of thousands of warheads capable of vaporizing cities in seconds. Underground silos, hidden submarines, and strategic bombers formed a triad of destruction that could ensure mutual annihilation. This balance of terror known as MAD, mutually assured destruction, kept the peace not through trust, but through the certainty of shared extinction. In homes across America and the Soviet Union, families built fallout shelters and children practiced duck and cover drills, believing wooden desks could protect them from atomic fire. Scientists who once worked to end World War II now questioned whether they had unleashed something that would end humanity itself. Yet, while the world waited in quiet dread, life continued, paradoxically normal. The space race became a symbol of this strange duality, technological triumph born from rivalry and fear. In 1957, the Soviet launch of Sputnik shocked the West. a beeping metal sphere orbiting above every nation, announcing that the heavens were no longer untouchable. The United States responded with its own rockets, and soon the Cold War extended beyond Earth. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon in 1969, it was a victory not just for science, but for ideology, a declaration that democracy could reach the stars. But beyond the headlines, darker wars simmered. In Vietnam, the jungles echoed with gunfire and screams as American forces fought an enemy that seemed invisible. Everywhere and nowhere, images of napalm and wounded children filled television screens, bringing the horror home in real time. Protests erupted across campuses and cities as citizens began to question the purpose of endless war. In the Soviet bloc, dissent grew silently under the weight of censorship, as entire nations were held captive behind an iron curtain. Berlin became the symbol of divisional wall of concrete and wire slicing through families, hopes, and dreams. Yet cracks began to form, not in the wall itself, but in the belief that it could last forever. From Cuba to Cambodia, from Prague to Tehran, the world trembled under the strain of opposing empires. And beneath it all, a quiet realization took root, that power built on fear could not last forever. Something was shifting, slow and unseen. Like the first tremors before an earthquake, the final echoes of World War II never truly faded. They simply changed form, reverberating through every nation, every generation that followed. The war had redrawn borders, but more than that, it had reshaped the human spirit. It had shown what civilization was capable of, its greatest acts of courage and its darkest depths of cruelty. Cities once reduced to ash had risen again from the ruins. Berlin, Tokyo, Warsaw, Hiroshima rebuilt, yet never forgetting the silence that came after the bombs. The survivors carried those memories like invisible scars, reminders that peace was fragile and freedom never guaranteed. In Europe, the ruins gave way to unity. Old enemies reached across the divides to form something new, the European Union, a fragile alliance born not from shared ambition but shared trauma. In the Pacific, Japan turned from empire to industry, transforming its devastation into determination, becoming a symbol of resilience. The United States emerged as a global superpower, its economy booming, its culture spreading, yet burdened by the haunting knowledge that its strength was built on destruction. The Soviet Union, too, rose as a rival power, its victory stained by the millions lost, its people both proud and weary. But beneath the banners and the parades, the question lingered: was the world truly safer, or had the war simply evolved into something colder, quieter, and more dangerous? The Holocaust left humanity staring into a moral abyss. In its aftermath came the trials at Nuremberg and Tokyo, where men who once commanded armies now faced justice for crimes beyond imagination. Never again, the world swore, but history, restless and cruel, has a way of testing promises. As the decades passed, new conflicts erupted: Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, each one a reminder that the seeds of violence were never fully buried. And yet, amidst the destruction, the world learned. The United Nations was formed, science flourished, medicine advanced, and voices once silenced began to speak. The story of World War II was not just a story of death, but of rebirth. It was the crucible in which modern humanity was forged, a warning written in blood and ash. Sit back, take a breath, and listen closely to the silence that follows. It carries the faintest echo of a distant thunder, the memory of a world at war, and the question it still whispers to us today: if that thunder ever returns, Will we remember what it cost to silence it the first time?